Hi there, motorhome owners. Today in your 2016 E450 Series Cutaway, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install Sumo springs for the rear axle. Now that we get the Sumo springs installed, we're going to hit our test course here to see how it feels. It should smooth out our ride. We're going to start in the uneven bump section, and that's going to simulate like hitting a pothole. And as we hit the pothole there, we do still have a little bit of sway, but what I notice more than anything actually is the steering wheel. The steering wheel really wants to jump, but the motorhome actually doesn't sway all that bad, but boy, this wheel really jerks on you. You've really got to hold hard. Next, we're going to do our even bump section, and that's going to simulate going over a speed bump. And when we hit that, we don't really feel too much difference. It's a little bit softer in the back when we go over it, so we don't have quite as much bounce, but it doesn't really make a huge difference there at these slow speeds that we're going at. It would likely make a much bigger difference at a higher operating speed. So we're going to get up into our slalom section here. We're heading into it here in just a minute. Get a little bit of speed going here. And now let's see how she feels. Oh. And boy, there's very minimal sway on this thing. I mean, this is pretty phenomenal. You can feel, a little bit of the G's throwing you left and to right when we do this, but as far as the tilt that we've got, wow. I mean, if the customer had problems with cabinets opening and closing before and stuff, he definitely should notice a huge difference now, because I was going pretty aggressive with it, and I really didn't even hear stuff knocking around too much, just kind of the normal creaks that you hear in the body. Now, to further tame these big motorhomes like this, you can get a set of sway bars for both the front and the rear, and those are going to help to further reduce sway. And the issue that we noticed here when I was on the test course a moment ago was the steering wheel really wanted to jerk when you hit a bump. And you can minimize that quite a bit with a steering stabilizer. Roadmaster carries those. It has a chock on it with a dampener that'll help to reduce that impact when you hit it. And it also has a spring mechanism on it that returns the steering wheel to center. So when it does jerk the wheel to the left or to the right like that, you're not the only one bringing it back to center. The spring mechanism's also helping you to just make you have a little bit more control over the motorhome and not experience so much of a deviation in your steering wheel when you hit those impacts. So here we can see our Sumo spring installed. It is a replacement for your factory Jounce bumper, which we've got right here to show you a comparison between the two. And you can see our Jounce bumper here is just minuscule in comparison with our Sumo spring. Now, the rubber on our Jounce bumper is a much stronger and Heartier rubber, but for the most part, this Jounce bumper here will really never even touch this axle. It only really hits that if the suspension was going to bottom out. This guy's here to prevent metal on metal contact, so that's why it's such a hard rubber, but it's really not designed in most cases to really ever to be in use. It's just kind of an emergency thing there. Our Sumo spring contacts our axle already, and we have the back of our vehicle lifted up just a little bit. So once we let it back on the ground, we are actually going to preload this just a little bit, and that means we're going to get assist from our Sumo spring throughout our suspension travel here. And this is going to help to support some of the heavy weight of our vehicle. It's going to help smooth out the ride a little bit, because if you hit any potholes or impacts on the road, the force that's going to transfer into the frame here has to kind of travel through our suspension components, and this will help dampen and remove a lot of that impact force that you feel on the inside. They also work really well for helping to minimize sway, because as your vehicle starts to rock to the left or to the right, it's going to compress our Sumo spring here, and the spring wants to kind of remain in its normal resting position like you see it here. So it's going to be pushing back that whole time, reducing how much sway you get, and minimizing how much kind of back and forth oscillations you can get from that sway. Because as you rock one way and you go to rock back, you typically go beyond center and start to kind of teeter until you straighten back out. So this will make that even less, giving you just an overall more comfortable ride. Another benefit of these is that it does help to reduce driver fatigue, because if your vehicle is more easily to control and isn't swaying as much, that means there's less that you have to compensate for as a driver, so you have more energy when you reach your destination, and that's especially true on those really long trips. We'll begin our installation here with our RV parked on level ground. The first thing that you're going to need to do is we need additional space between the axle and the frame, so that way we can get our Sumo springs in, and also we can more easily remove our Jounce bumpers. To do this, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can place a jack underneath the vehicle and jack up the back and then put some stands under it. You also have your leveling jacks that are on your motorhome. You could use those to raise it up. You still want to make sure you put jack stands underneath the frame though to support the frame. We don't want to just trust hydraulics holding the vehicle up while we're working underneath. Once you've got it lifted up, we don't have the wheels all the way off the ground, but you need a decent gap there to be able to fit it in. I've got it pretty much at the lowest that we can kind of get it in there. If you can go up a little bit higher than this, that would work out great, but this will do kind of where we're at right here. So now we've got everything supported, we got our stands under the frame, we can head underneath to start getting our SumoSprings installed. So we're now underneath the vehicle. This is our rear axle right here. We're working on the driver's side. That's the driver's side leaf spring stack, and straight up above the axle, that's our factory Jounce bumper there, that little tiny guy. So we're gonna be removing that. That's where our SumoSpring will install. So we're gonna use a 15mm wrench up here to get this removed. So you just got to go up here on top. The nut's just on the other side of the frame. There is a lot of hoses and stuff here in the way, but it's located just right on the other side of where you see the bumper going through the frame there. And we're just going to get our wrench on the nut and take the nut off of there. And if you're doing it with a wrench like this, it is pretty tight. It is going to take you a little bit here. It's a fairly long stud, so if you have a ratcheting wrench, that would work out a lot better to get this off of here. And if you have some tools that'll fit, that'd be great, but it is a pretty tight area where you're unlikely to be able to fit a power tool in. And that does depend on your particular vehicle here, because I mean, each motorhome is assembled slightly different, so you may or may not have slightly more room to work with on another one versus the one we have here. And I'm keeping just a hair of pressure on the bottom of the Jounce bumper, because as it drops down, it's going to want to start to spin. And as it's spinning, you're not removing the nut. So keeping it pushed up a little bit makes it sure that it contacts the frame so the nut is actually turning off of there. And once you get it loose enough, should be able to get the rest of it off by hand. It is a locking nut, so you got to go pretty far with a wrench before you're able to remove the rest by hand. So here we have our upper bracket right here. This is the upper bracket. The stud there in the middle is going to poke up through the hole right where our factory Jounce bumper was attached. This bracket's going to attach in the same place. And you'll notice on bottom we do have a couple of holes for different positionings for mounting our spring to it. We're going to be mounting it in the rear hole. You also get 2 lengths of bolts in your kit for various adapters. You'll have a little spacer adapter in the kit, and you want to use the longer bolt if you're going to use the spacer. We are going to be using the spacer to get a little bit more contact. So just keep that in mind. And this is just going to poke up through this hole here. Looks like there's a bracket right here. This brake line bracket also has a hole in it, and it was secured with the same stud, so we need to line those holes back up as well. There we go. Got it to slide through there. We also need to make sure we've got this oriented appropriately. So that needs to sit on the bottom of the frame, and those lips there will touch kind of see the lip, the little overhang here. The raised portion of this needs to be on the inside of that lip, so that way it contacts it, just like we got it there. We'll then take our washer, place it on top, and put our nut on top of that. And once we get our nut on there, we can go ahead and snug that down. Now, before we snug it down on this particular side, since we got so many hoses and stuff right here, we are going to drop our bolt down first, because it's going to be a little bit easier to do that at this time. If you're using the shorter bolt without the spacer, it's not as big of a deal, but since we're going to be using the longer bolt and the longer spacer, we're going to have a hard time getting those in later because of all these hoses. So we're going to feed our bolt in now and drop it down through the rearmost hole. And you can see here that it is going to be a little difficult because of all these hoses that are running right here in the way. All All right, so we might actually, just because it's such a difficult spot with all these hoses, I'm going to loosen up the nut a little bit more just so I can drop it down further. I want to try not to drop it all the way out just because it was a difficult time getting these to line up. Oh, well, it fell out of there. So we're going to drop the bolt in now since all these hoses are here. All right, and we'll get it back up there, making sure that it does line up with that bracket and stuff again. Make sure our washer's on there, and then we put our nut on there. So you can see it is going to be a little difficult to tighten down that particular bolt on this side just because of the routing of the hoses and wiring and stuff that's here. So we got that in there now. We got our bolt dropped down. We're going to go ahead and snug down the nut on top. You can use your 15 millimeter, but it does switch over to a standard size. So we're going to use this 9/16. That is a better fit. And we also have a ratcheting one here to make things go a little bit easier. Now when snugging this down, we do want to double check those lips. Make sure that they are up against the vertical portion here, and this vertical portion goes up against the bottom of the frame. And then we're just going to snug it down. Once you get it snug, that's pretty much as tight as you want to go, because you can actually over tighten this and start bending the bracket. So we got it nice and snug. It's definitely not going to go anywhere. We don't want to go anymore. It's a nylon locking nut on top, so it shouldn't back itself off. It should maintain its snug pressure there. Now we can take our spring and put it in place and thread it into the bolt. And if you're not going to use the spacer, you would want to use the shorter bolt in the kit. Since we are using the spacer here, this is our spacer. We got the longer bolt. We use that one instead. I'm going to drop that down through there like that. And then we're going to get our spring in place. And if you lift up the vehicle just a little bit higher, you could get it in there a little bit more easily than what we are. But we're kind of maxed out on our jack stands. So this is it. We can then also take that bolt that dropped down, push that back up just a little bit, and then get those to line up. Now we're going to push down on the bolt. And I actually like to spin the spring in a lot of cases, especially when it's super tight like this, because it's really difficult to get your hand in there. So another thing you could do is you could grab your wrench. You could probably get that in there on top of the bolt, and that'll prevent the bolt from being able to spin, and it'll also keep it down. And as we're spinning our spring here, we should be threading it onto that bolt as we're holding the bolt still. And there we go. It's starting to stop there. Now it does want you to torque this bolt to 25 foot-pounds, but I can tell you now, if you don't have a extended, extra long crow's foot or tool that operates similar to a crow's foot that can get in there, you're not going to be able to get in there. With any kind of socket, or even a regular crow's foot also will not fit in here. So just make sure you get it snugged. What I would recommend doing if you don't have a torque wrench, if you don't have a tool that can actually get in there and you can't find one locally, what you can do is take a different bolt on your vehicle that you know is going to be similar tightness. Like you could do a lug nut. A lug nut would work out very well. And then use the torque wrench that you're going to that is like a similar size of the wrench or something that you're going to use for length, and then set it to like a similar torque, and then use it on that lug nut so you can get a feel in your hand for how tight that amount of torque is, and then you can go back here with your regular tool and try to mimic that. All right, so once we get it tightened on there, at that point we've got this side installed. We're going to perform the exact same procedures over on the other side to get that side installed. And that completes our installation of Sumo springs on the rear axle of our 2016 E-Series Cutaway motorhome.